All right, thanks, Nadia. I mean, comrades, if you're at Marxism this year, it means that you're probably aware that Islamophobia is the latest, cutting edge of racism in the West, and this is true for obviously the capitalist states, but also for the far right who are trying to make a comeback under the banner of Islamophobia, under the banner of a particular hatred for Muslim women, for refugees, and so on and so forth. And with this, you deal politically, right? You organize against racism in your neighborhoods, on the streets, in your unions and workplaces. And really, this is why Socialist Worker is carrying a call for mobilization against Donald Trump on the 13th of July and against the fascists, Tommy Robinson, the day after that. But really, outside or maybe on the margin of the hardcore racist circles, we often have really lazy assumptions, which have somehow trickled down to some sections of the left. So those are lazy assumptions about Islam as a religion, that there is something particular about Islam that makes it stand out from other religions and makes it, very, very rigid, very oppressive, unchanging, whether throughout history or among social classes. So those are essentialist assumptions, and sometimes we must. It's not always easy, but we must differentiate between people that we have to fight and people that we have to convince. Perhaps a good place to start is to try to paint a picture of the emergence of early Islam. Who were the first Muslims? Why did they really adopt this religion and these moral and even actually political principles? So the first question is, not the first question, the first period we're going to look at, we're in the 5th century, okay? And what we call today the Middle East, so roughly between the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, and all the way to modern-day Iran. Really, in the 5th century, this region of the world is dominated by two great empires. We've got, of course, the Byzantine Empire with its capital Constantinople, which is obviously the Eastern Christian Empire. And we've got the Sassanid, or the Persian Empire, over modern-day Iran and Iraq. And, of course, there are other empires and so on and so forth in China and India and all that. But, right now we're concerned with this really big historical playing field that is the Middle East. Particularly, we want to look at the Arabian Peninsula. So today it would be Saudi Arabia all the way to Yemen, all the Gulf countries, and so on and so forth. And actually, ancient Greek geographers had a relatively accurate knowledge of the region. So they tell us that today's Yemen was inhabited at the time by people that they called the Southern Arabs. So it was really a string of kingdoms and city-states that were relatively advanced and that played a really important role in trade between China, India, the Persians, and the Byzantine Empire, because they controlled ports along the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. And they were separated from modern-day Syria by a huge desert to the north, which is called the Rub' al-Khali, which is today's Saudi Arabia, basically. And this desert was inhabited by a different kind of Arabs. The Greeks call them Sarakenoi. I'm certainly mispronouncing, but it means people who live in tents. And they simply identified as the Arabs in general. Now, the words of the French historian Maxime Rollinson kind of really paint the picture. He says that the contrast was great between the southern Arabs, settled, civilized, living in complex and organized states with a permanent bureaucracy, and the desert Arabs, an ensemble of wandering tribes with rough manners, deprived from almost any material wealth, hungry and free. And yet history is a bit ironic, because it was amongst those unlikely nomads that one of the greatest world religions would emerge within only a few generations. And they would also be able to to carve out an empire that was, bigger than the Roman Empire at one point. So, how and why did Islam emerge in this unlikely context? The the Lebanese communist Hussein Mroueh, who's one of my main sources for this talk, he writes that Islam, by its social content as well as its religious doctrine, emerged as an evolution of what was already brewing in the depth of pre-Islamic society. Okay, so we have to look at pre-Islamic society, and this is what I'm going to start by doing. So we need to take a closer look at those desert Arabs. The first question that we ask is quite simple, which is, how do they make a living? So I've already said that they're nomadic people, so they're always wandering. They're never they never stay at the same point for any length of time. So they cannot be peasants, okay, because you have the land and it takes time and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean either that they are isolated hunter-gatherer tribes, because you're in the desert, so there isn't much to hunt. There's even less to gather. So, you can't really make a living in this way. What they are is they're a special type of nomadic people. They're pastoral people. Okay, so mainly they live from herding camels. Okay, so they have camel herds, which they sometimes eat, but most of the time they use them for transportation and for their milk. And they exchange camel milk with, dates, other agricultural products, really, really rough, perhaps, crafts products and stuff like that from nearby settled communities. Okay, those communities were usually Christian or Jewish. But so we have a very important element here, is that they're nomadic, but they're not completely isolated. Okay, there is trade, so there is this idea that they do have to trade with people who are fundamentally different from them. Now, this is trade at still a very, very, very basic level, but it will play a very, very important role in the future. But for now, they lead a very precarious lifestyle. So there's no real material wealth to talk of. All it consisted of was tents and the camels that they had. So on this basis, there basically isn't enough for there to be rich people and poor people. So it's a classless society. Okay, there are no social classes. The scarce property that they had was shared, and it was supposed to be communal. So it's a classless society, but it's not a completely horizontal society. There is a chief, and it's usually a man. And this chief's role is kind of leading the tribe in its interaction with nature, because they wander from one water spot to another, and in their interaction with other tribes. But the leader doesn't really, it doesn't mean that there is a state, okay? He doesn't have a police, doesn't have an army, he doesn't have any civil servants to kind of enforce his will. So he leads by consent, okay? And in this context, the principal ideological value of this society is tribal honor, okay? The chief's honor was a measure of his capacity to sacrifice himself for his fellow tribespeople, and to maintain the honor of the tribe by avenging any killing that came from another tribe. Okay, so there are a bunch of tribes in the desert. There are no unifying set of laws. It's basically tribe against tribe, which means that you could end up with really long periods of vendetta between tribes, but also it meant that even when they were looting or fighting, sometimes tribes were reluctant to kill because they knew that this could, really escalate and start a very long vendetta. So they had rough manners, but they weren't, always at each other's throat. So their religious beliefs at the time were polytheistic. Okay, so each tribe, as it wandered around the desert, carried its own idols. Those idols were generally linked in one way or another to nature, but they were very much linked to every tribe. So every tribe had its own idol, and in terms of cultural production, that was it really, because they're living in such harsh conditions, and while material conditions don't mechanically determine your culture, but they certainly set a certain set of limits beyond which you cannot go. And when you're a wandering tribe looking for food and water, you can't do much in terms of cultural production. You can't really have sculptures. Architecture is really out of the way. So the only other bit of cultural production, and the principal bit of cultural production of those people, it was spoken word. It was poetry. Each tribe had its poets, and they were the historians, they were the entertainers, they were the ideologues of the tribe. And they played the role of political agitators. You know, if a tribes member dishonored himself or herself by their behavior, you know, they could be sure that they would get a good beating by the poet. That would be really humiliating. So he kind of kept everyone in line in a way. Okay. And those pre-Islamic poets, actually, many of them have, many of their verses have survived until today, so they're still recited today in the Arab world. But this is only a preliminary picture, okay? Islam emerges ultimately because there are huge, dramatic transformations that are sweeping through these societies. One of the main reasons is the slow decline and collapse of the southern Arabs' kingdoms. So these they decline and collapse. We don't really have time to go into why and how this happened. But the consequence is that trade, the Silk Road, is disturbed. Okay, their ports don't really function anymore. So caravans have to start crossing the desert to get into Egypt, to get into Damascus, to get up to Mesopotamia. And they start crossing the Arabic territories. And, I mean, there's no pretty way of putting it, but there's a business transaction that happens. The Arabs basically tell the traders, well, that's a very nice caravan you got here. It would be a shame if someone looted it, so do you want to pay us for protection? Protection from whom? Well, our cousins are probably ambushing you, you know, a bit down the road. Anyway, it's very complicated. We don't really understand business here at Marxism, but they start accumulating wealth. They started accumulating wealth, and it's not enough wealth to disturb the trade between the great empires, but it is enough wealth to disturb the internal functioning of Arab societies. Okay? So now that they're accumulating wealth, they start running their own caravans, so they have goods to carry. And so they need to settle somewhere because you can't always be wandering around. And this is how the first towns begin to emerge. The main town is Mecca. Okay, and I just want to give you a sense of the historical urgency of this change. Okay, this isn't really hunter-gatherers who, over thousands of years with the Neolithic Revolution, are adapting to agriculture and so on and so forth. This is happening within a few generations. They're settling. And there's an ancient poetry that describes Mecca at the time as a land which refuses to yield. So there is absolutely no agriculture in Mecca. So it can only survive off trade. So it is a trade hub. Okay, this is very important. And the consequence of this newfound prosperity is, of course, social inequality. The old communal regime is completely shattered. You have usually a small layer of entrepreneurs who start accumulating the wealth, usually around the tribe chief who uses his influence. And camel herds grow in size. They become really, really big. We're talking about hundreds and even thousands of camels. But they're privatized, so they're no longer communal property. Pastoral land is also privatized. Water is privatized. The Tories didn't really invent anything. Which means that you've got the majority of the tribes members are deprived from their means of existence. So you've got this really big contradiction that, yes, you're reaching a higher level of civilization, uncondescendingly, we can say that. But at the same time, you're leaving behind the vast majority of your population who are now basically the urban poor. So the powerful tribe of Quraysh, it is the most powerful Arab tribes, it seizes Mecca. And the ancient poetry tells the story of its leader, Qusay, and it describes him as, he became wealthy and thus his honor increased. So we have the first link between political power and wealth. This is something new for Arabs. But we also have, in the symbolic of now, honor used to be about communal property, about the values of solidarity in the desert and so on and so forth. And now the most honorable man is the richest man, and he's leading a tribe of really poor people. So we've got this, really big contradiction between what their ideology is supposed to express and what it's actually describing. Okay. Now, so the institution of the tribe doesn't disappear, and the tribal culture doesn't disappear, but it is modified by those economic tensions. The aristocracy, the Qurayshi aristocracy, settles around a sanctuary called the Kaaba, which is still the main destination of pilgrimage today for Muslims. So they settle around the Kaaba, and they put their idols there, and they put the idols of the other tribes there. So the Kaaba itself becomes a religious symbol, and it becomes a destination of pilgrimage for tribes from all over Arabia. Okay, it's still polytheistic. Okay, you've got many gods, etc., and so on and so forth. But there is this kind of material pull towards a unification of religious practice, and of course there is a pilgrimage season. It lasts 3 months every year, and by a very fortunate coincidence, it's also a period of truth between the tribes. So they stop fighting and they start trading during this time. So it becomes a really big, long trade hub. Becomes a big trade fair. As many as 20,000 people gather in Mecca at the time, and this is we're talking about tribes that numbered maybe hundreds of people only 2-3 generations before. So this is a really big shift. So they have giant trade fairs, and the leaders of the tribes don't really set up state institutions, but they have sort of councils, and they talk to each other, and they discuss matters of trade and war and so on and so forth. And then you have a kind of unification of Arabic culture. For the first time, we can talk about an almost unified Arabic culture. Arabic language begins to organically unify around the Qurayshi dialect because everybody's flocking to Mecca, and you have to trade with them, and so you begin to talk a bit like them. And this is more or less the Arabic that we know today. This is the Qurayshi Arabic. And the poets acquire an even bigger role because now they're sort of spin doctors for rich tribal leaders. And they engage in really epic oratory battles with one another. They still talk about the virtues of communal life, but it's a life that no longer exists. And then they sing the praises of their leaders, and they try to ridicule their rivals. And this is in front of hundreds of people, so they become really kind of stars at the time. And the most famous of them are still famous today. So we've got this tendency towards cultural unification, but the problem is that all of this, from the point of view of the ruling class, all of this rests on the polytheistic worship, and actually still the political division between the tribes. Okay, so it's as if the tribes leader kind of created the objective economic basis for a superior ideological unity of the Arabs, but their position as a ruling class means that they abhor any kind of challenge to their ideology, which is still tainted with tribal divisions. So this is a big contradiction. And another big contradiction is that at the time there is word that reaches Mecca of really the two big pillars of the old world for them. The Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire, they're starting to vacillate. There's word of military pressure on them. Traders bring words of social unrest and famine and so on and so forth. So you can imagine that at the time, Arabs are feeling that, there is something world historic going on. And perhaps this is reflected in the very dramatic and sometimes even apocalyptic tone of the early Quranic revelations. So in this context, it is usual for groups of people or individuals to start, challenging the dominant ideology. And one of them is Muhammad bin Abdullah. He's born in the year, around the year 571. And he's a member of the ruling Qurayshi tribe, but he's one of the poor ones. Okay, so he doesn't have any wealth of his own. So it's this contradictory position that he is protected by the tribal honor of the most powerful tribe, but at the same time, he doesn't have any wealth of his own. And so he has to find work on a caravan for his rich and widowed cousin, Khadija. And he witnessed the aristocracy really ostentation, really badly flaunting their fortune that they amassed through trade monopolies. And at the same time, you had small merchants, artisans and craftsmen, and other townspeople who were really cut off from the sources of wealth. And they formed the mass of the urban poor, around whom loitered all sorts of, money lenders, middlemen, and other scavengers. Now, at some point, Khadija proposes marriage to Muhammad. He agrees, which Okay, which sort of frees him from the burden of constant work, so he has more time to meditate and so on and so forth. And it was during one of his meditations in a cave over Mecca that according to tradition, the first revelation was made to him by Gabriel, and that he learned that he was the prophet, the messenger of Allah. And those revelations constitute, over the rest of his life, constitute the Quran, what we know today as the Quran. Now, before we go on, okay, I'm assuming that some of us in this room are religious believers and some of us aren't. I belong to the second group, but, we can still find a common ground around this, I think. One Enlightenment critic of Muhammad, I think it was Voltaire, I'm not sure, but they simply argued that he was an imposter. He was a very cunning and very skilled imposter. They don't deny the historical role that he played. But he was nevertheless a liar who was motivated by sheer ambition and kind of, manipulated really ignorant and superstitious people. Now, this is an interpretation that we as Marxists must absolutely reject. I think, first of all, there is a lot of evidence, a lot of psychoanalysis that has been done on Muhammad that shows that actually it was most likely that he was very, very sincere. But I think more fundamentally, the kind of easy idea of, an intelligent imposter and irrational people kind of coming together and beginning Islam, it actually sort of obscures the real social reasons. The question we have to answer is, why did his message actually find a grip in that social reality? Okay, so we don't dismiss religion. We obviously don't dismiss religious believers, but we take it very seriously, and we try to find, the kind of the rational kernel in every religious message. That's what I'm going to try to do. Okay, so Hussein Mroueh argues that the various Quranic surahs, that is the chapters and the verses, are concrete illustrations of phenomena that shaped 7th century Arabian society, even if these are sometimes expressed symbolically, metaphorically, in the shape of vague or precise guidelines, or even as promises of heavenly reward or hellish punishment. So we don't have much time, so I really want to focus on two main ideological concepts that we find in the Quran. The first is Tawheed, which means it's Arabic for unification. Obviously, it's the unification of worship, so you have one God. There's a lot of insistence in Islam on the unity of God because, it emerged in a very polytheistic society. But the late Chris Harman writes that Islam was not simply a set of beliefs or rules for moral behavior. It was also a political program for reforming society, replacing the barbarism of competition, often armed, between tribes and families, with an ordered ummah community based on a single code of laws. Okay, so Tawheed, it takes on a further social meaning, okay? And we will see that the very process of religious unification of the Arab tribes under Islam is actually a process of cultural, ideological, and political unification. And the second concept is Akhirah, which you might call it Judgment Day. So it basically says that, again, I'm using the words of Hussein Mroueh, it's an explicit promise of heavenly salvation for the socially deprived and the oppressed, and a promise of eternal punishment for the oppressors. Okay, so many of Muhammad's early followers included slaves and former slaves and poor people, the oppressed of the time, because slaves are not only, it not only sucks to be a slave, but even after you're free, you're still not a member of any tribe, so you can be killed really, really easily because no one's going to have to avenge your life. So these people are completely, remote from the tribal organization and actually oppressed by it, and they see Islam as a great calling. But it was not only the oppressed; it was also sons of some of the wealthy merchants of Mecca at the time, which shows that even among people linked to the ruling class, there was a sense of something was wrong and something had to change. Okay. Now, over the year, we have a small sect of dozens and then hundreds of Muslims that can emerge in Mecca. And I'm not using the word sect in a negative manner. It's just that they're in a very hostile environment, so they have to, really keep tight knit and close knit. But the Muslim appeal starts to grow, and then there's two events a few weeks apart that are very important for Muhammad and are really devastating. The first one is the death of Khadija. She was older than him, and she was the first convert, and she played a very important role as a support and also as kind of an authority for Muhammad. So he was really affected by that. And then a few weeks later, his uncle died. Now, his uncle was a member of Quraysh. He never converted, but he remained close to Muhammad. And he was really his protector in Mecca. This is why Muhammad was not killed in Mecca. It's because his uncle belonged to Quraysh. And people still had this thing about tribal honor. But with him out of the way, the leaders decided to kill Muhammad. So they held an election, and they elected, the story goes, they elected one member from each tribe to participate in the assassination of Muhammad, so that it would look like kind of a common endeavor, a way of unifying the tribes. Muhammad heard about this, and he was really unimpressed by this wonderful display of democracy. And he entered into talk with leaders of Medina, which is a settlement a couple of 100 miles from Mecca, and he decided to leave. And this is the Hijrah. Muhammad and hundreds of his companions leave in the year 622. And this is year one of the Muslim calendar. Now, Medina, it was a smaller trade hub, less successful than Mecca, but it was also an agricultural center. So, which means that you had Jewish people actually there. So they were there for a very long time because they were settled. So you had Arab Jewish tribes and polytheistic Arab tribes, and it was the leaders of the tribes of the polytheistic tribes who had welcomed Muhammad. And this is really the moment where Islam can start to be practiced openly. It goes out of its shell. It's in a friendly environment. The first mosque is built very quickly. It becomes a gravitational center, first for the Muslim community and then for the whole town. Slowly but surely, Muhammad won the conversion and the political adhesion of the polytheistic tribes. He could propose an alternative worldview which valued the individual as part of a larger community. And he was able actually to put an end to the endless vendettas that really plagued life at Medina. And he put in practice forms of social solidarity, charity towards the poor. He bans the excesses of the rich, like usury and stuff like that. And he praises the ideal Muslim is the honest merchant, So there's no shame in making money, but you have to do it honestly and in a moderate manner. So there is an attempt with Islam really early attempt to harmonize and conciliate society that nevertheless carries social antagonisms. Okay, but Islam is here to not radically redistribute resources, but rather, bring some sort of cultural and also material harmony to society. But even if we wouldn't call it revolutionary today, it was certainly revolutionary at the time, because the mere thought of the rich Meccans having a responsibility towards the poor was really abhorrent for the rulers. So it required the revolution to actually impose it. So in Medina, we have the first germs of Islamic institutions. There is still no state. So Muhammad leads by consent. This consent rests on, of course, his religious legitimacy, but also his political skills. He was a very, very good politician, actually. He knew when to take a step back. He knew when to push. He knew when to emphasize this or that aspect. He kind of bended the stick when it was needed. I don't know if maybe it reminds you of someone. Oh, no, I have to. Sorry. Okay. And he can muster an army. And after a while, the Meccan leaders start thinking that, well, maybe it's better if we welcome Muhammad because our trade is being really disturbed and everything. And Islam has become really a powerful force in the region. And so they open Mecca back, and Muhammad goes back to Mecca. And this is when really almost the whole of the Arabian tribes embrace Islam, and they send emissaries to Mecca and so on. But it was a short-lived success. 2 years later, Muhammad dies, and all the latent tensions start to emerge. A lot of the last-minute converted kind of convert back from Islam, and we have what we may call a counter-revolution that begins. Wars against Islam, and it was certainly the period that religious zeal was at its height. Okay, so it was a really bloody civil war. The Muslims nevertheless win it. They unite Arabia, and which means that they can start invading Persia and Iran, and they have spectacular success because they're on the rise, and those empires are actually hated by the people that lived under them. So barely a few years after Muhammad's death, we have the Meccan leaders ruling over Damascus, over Alexandria, over Aleppo, and so on and so forth. So it's a completely different environment. And they're ruling over mostly Christians and Jews. And they don't really ask them to convert. And the Christians and Jews, some of them greet the Muslim as liberators. Paradoxically, there's the flourishing of all the small Christian sects that used to be called heretics by the Greek clergy. And even the clergy itself is quite happy with the Muslims because the Greeks are gone and now the locals can rise in the ranks. So they become the Damascus clergy is actually a support of the early Islamic Caliphate. And this is when, so there is, really big religious tolerance. They do take a special tax from non-Muslims, but this is at any rate lower than what the Byzantines used to take, so people are kind of okay with it. And there's even this really ironic, and I don't know if it's funny, letters that come from Muslim civil servants sending really angry letter to the caliph, to the leader of the Islamic nation, asking him to issue a religious fatwa against conversions to Islam because it was disturbing their tax collection. So you can't get any more pragmatic than that. And the caliph himself, Omar, was really pragmatic. There's a French Orientalist, Régis Blanchard, who says Omar raised pragmatism to the level of genius because he started a thing called ijtihad, which is the creative interpretation of Holy Scripture. So fundamentally, it meant that he was discarding some of the teachings of Muhammad, who had barely died a few years before, and he was emphasizing others because, he realized that now he had a huge state to run, and they were no longer in Arabia. Okay, so in this way, he plants the seed of what becomes Arab Islamic philosophy. Now, unfortunately, the social contradictions don't go away. The Meccan rich, who had fought Islam for almost 20 years, are now ruling in its name over really a vast empire. They amass more and more wealth, and very soon you have an Islamic aristocracy and the Islamic urban poor. And so Islam itself, from the religion of a united people, it becomes itself kind of an ideological terrain. So the rulers, the conservative rulers, try to rule in the name of Islam. And then there are social revolts also in the name of Islam, various Shia heresies, the partisans of Ali, and so on and so forth. So I guess to sum up, and thanks Nadia for being so indulgent, I guess to sum up, Islam was never, even from the beginning, even in those dark times, dark ages, it was never a fixed ideology that hovered above society and commanded the full adhesion of the blindly faithful. Okay, it was rather, like any religion, like any ideology, we have to look at the social context of people who believe in it and start asking, why? What's appealing about this? Okay, so so I'll just stop here, and I guess hope the discussion will be interesting. Thank you.
Okay, that was a great talk. I learned an awful lot. One of the questions before I came was I was asking myself, well, why did Islam establish itself in that particular place, in that culture? And you've explained that very well. One thing I have got a question about is, you talked about how Islam and the state that developed spread outside Saudi Arabia, and that seems to have happened very, very quickly in historic terms. My question is, how do you explain if like the rapid development of that empire into North Africa, and obviously the Middle East first, but into North Africa as well. Why did that happen so quickly?
Thank you. Miriam will be followed by Comrade at the front.
You told us that the Jews were around and Jewish tribes, and obviously Jews were monotheistic, and I just wondered how much influence and how it happened that Jewish stories, the Old Testament stories and the patriarchs got into the Quran.
Yeah, basically I have a question. We had a discussion in Frankfurt in Germany just a couple of weeks ago, sort of a debate, and the young Muslim woman was talking about how progressive Islam was, and she gave one concrete example, which is quite convincing, that women can also have heritage and pass on their wealth and so on and so forth. So that is progressive. But on the other hand, how many women had wealth? So that's a bit. So perhaps you could say something about that.
Thank you. Yeah, got a hand. I'd like to call the guy at the back and then the brother on the side here with the headphones around his neck. You can come forward, by the way, in the meantime. Who just raised their hand in the last slots? Can you do it again? Okay, got you.
Right, 2 questions. Can you explain the satanic verses business? Right? Secondly, according to Christian propaganda, the Muslims were prevented from conquering the whole of Europe by a Christian military leader called Charles Martel, who fought a battle which prevented the Muslim getting up from Spain into France. So could Islam have conquered the whole of Europe and wiped out Western Christianity? But Frederick Engels wrote something where he said that he gave a different explanation. He didn't just say the Christians won a battle and the whole of history would have been different if the battle had gone differently. He said something like Muslim ideology wouldn't have suited European society, and that was why it didn't spread any further than the north of Spain. So do you know anything about that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so mine isn't really a question, but just from a perspective from a British Muslim, I often get asked by friends, oh, so were you forced into Islam? This was very early on in the 90s. Why did you become Muslim? Now, I'm not going to deny it. I became Muslim because obviously I was born to a Muslim family, right? So I'm not going to deny that. However, when I started developing my own critical thinking, and I put that around between 16 and 18 and I started questioning my faith, I realized, contrary to when I hear idiots, especially from the right, say, oh, Islam is backwards, actually, when I've looked into Islam, I found it incredibly forward-thinking, especially for its time period. For example, prior to Islam, women were female babies were being killed because they were considered expensive to keep. And with the introduction of Islam, the Quran outlawed that, saying that this is an abomination, this is not the way to behave, this is not how civil people are. Muhammad, peace be upon him, was an actual feminist. Not only was his wife a businesswoman and his employer, and a lot of blokes find that a bit odd, but I'll tell you something, he championed women's rights throughout his life, and also even on his last sermon he explained in a patriarchal society the importance of a woman's position in society. He also referred to the woman as the feet of the mother is entrance to heaven. So women had a very strong position in society. Similarly, when women didn't have rights in Arab society, you could have sex with them and discard them. What happened was that Islam said you have to marry women. You can't just have sex with them and you can't just discard them. So it gave women financial rights. You also had to give her divorce settlements before marriage. So in the event that you get married and divorced, she's got some financial asset. Furthermore, if she gets pregnant, she's got financial securities. Again, these are just a couple of points as to why I see Islam as very progressive. And the reason why loads of black people and loads of Asians adopted and embraced Islam is because it is against capitalism. It doesn't allow the rich or the poor to divide each other, to look down at each other. No, there's no difference between black and white. And I think that's the reason why loads of poor people saw this faith and thought, do you know what, I can be an equal to my brother, whether he's white, black, Asian, Chinese, whatever. So I just wanted to give that perspective from my perspective. Yeah.
No, I want to start really by thanking the speaker, because I think that the entire talk has really helped to dispel this horrible myth that somehow there is just one homogenous development of Islam which is predicated upon violence, jihad, terrorism and what have you. And I think that really what it speaks volumes of is the rich diversity of different types of traditions, different influences, that we see across the Arabian Peninsula, evolving over many decades and generations. I think that the whole question about the spread of Islam and how it appears to be so rapid, and it is rapid in many respects, but I think it's also important to bear in mind that, you know, as Jad said, you had the development of Islam happening in the middle of two major empires. These are the two superpowers of the time in terms of the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire in the East. And these empires were like all empires. They were oppressive, they were exploitative, they had within them minorities that were oppressed. So the Byzantine Empire oppressed Christian minorities, such as the Nestorians. They all equally didn't particularly like Jewish communities, so there were lots of reasons for discontent and internal discontent and dissent within these empires. And once you begin to see the complete and utter collapse and disintegration of these empires, it throws the societies that they had dominated, including the Arabian Peninsula, into complete freefall. You know, all the old values, all the old cultural traditions, the old tribal sort of networks that existed, they completely are torn asunder. And it's in this kind of society that you begin to see why both materially as well as politically and socially the sort of message of Muhammad could begin to make sense. This was a region in which there had been many forecasts that, you know, a new Messiah was going to return. Now, these ideas emanated out of the two other monotheistic traditions predating Islam. Both Judaism and Christianity believed that there was going to be a new Messiah that would come. They obviously had an impact, and Muhammad's ideas and his particular role fitted at this moment in time. One of the great things about his teachings, and, you know, I thought Jad put it really well when he talks about how he's trying to sort of homogenize and unify a society which is still racked full of all sorts of antagonisms. The teachings of early Islam could speak to both ruling elites as they were emerging and dominating, as well as to the poor, as well as to slaves that would convert to Islam, because both different classes could see a message in this that fitted their particular needs. And that's why it's quite important, I think, to register that when you look at this total development in its historical and its material context, its political context, that's why when we're examining any particular religion, it's not a question of saying, oh, Islam is more progressive or Islam is more barbaric. I mean, that kind of simplistic analysis is really what the right wing really want, and those Islamophobes want, because they want to have a world divided between, you know, Christianity, which is somehow seen as being liberal, and Islam seen as being barbaric and completely violent. No, we have to go much deeper into that to understand at every moment and each twist and turn why it is that a particular set of ideas, whether they're expressing themselves politically or whether they're expressing themselves using a mixture of religious language as well as political language, can begin to find expression and can begin to make sense to people in different moments in time. And that really is what the beauty of Marxism and the kind of analysis that we're trying to put forward is, in terms of attempting to explain this. Because if you're able to explain and understand it in that context, then you're also able to begin to explain how we as humanity can go much further beyond just the limitations of any particular religion into really fighting for something which is far better than that.
Thank you. All right, I'll call you up, and then I saw a woman raise her hands with glasses. Yep, if you come up as well, but you can speak first.
Thanks very much. I thought it was an absolutely brilliant talk. Just one particular question. Some modern historians argue that really the Arab conquests arise from the periphery of the old Byzantine and Persian empires, slogging each other out, slogging it out to a knockout draw, knocking out each other's. And really what you get is it's really from the periphery of the Levant that you get the arising of the Arab armies sometimes from the old soldiers of the previous armies, and that the references within the Quran are more pertaining to the periphery of the Levant rather than to Mecca itself. And that if you look in the early Arab empires, there is not a great Islamic presence in terms of symbols. It takes a few decades before those actually emerge. And that later Islam comes along as providing the ideological glue and justification for the Arab conquests as a new ideology for a new empire, conveniently using a dead prophet from the Arab desert. I'd be interested in your comments.
I've got a couple of questions and one other thing. I think it's really important to emphasise why people would choose to. I mean, you start with the 5th century, and I'm going right up to a bit more. But today, still, that people would choose to become members of the Islamic faith, because if you look at somebody like Malcolm X, even then, you could see how that faith actually had some appeal to people, because you could be a Muslim and you could be black, and that was fine. You know, you could be a black Muslim in America and be part of a community which actually had something to say about the racism of American society. And you can see that today, I think. I think that strand of what's happening is still true. The other thing I wanted to ask you a question is, I mean, you talked about diversity in Islam, that really right from the beginning you begin to get the development of sects and schisms and things, and people begin to go their own way. So you've got the difference between Shia and Sunni, and there's Sufi, and there's all sorts of different bits of the religion. And I think that's something that maybe needs exploring a bit, as to how that has continued to be a problem in Islam for people in Islamic faith. Because when people talk about, we're all part of them, and we're all part of a community, where people will say, well, why are you kicking the shit out of each other then, because you're a different part. And I mean, Christians do that as well. I'm not saying that's not true. We've done it for centuries. But the last thing is, I think it's true, the question about we could have been an Islamic empire, and Britain could have been part of it, because in Spain, that empire went right up to northern Spain. And I think what caused the problem was not so much the battles of the Christians, but the internal divisions within the ruling Arab elites inside Al-Andalus. And actually it was their divisions that actually meant that empire crumbled, and the Christians were able to take advantage of that.
Thank you. After the next speaker, would you like to come to the front?
I just have a really, really short question. Is there any historical or political connection to be possibly made between the economic structures of the early Islam? You described the taxation structures, the what we could call some degree of social security, cap on wealth, etc., and the later development of the welfare state in the West. Could there be some movement of ideas that could be traced between those two concepts, or it's just the far-fetched?
After the next speaker, saw a hand raised at the back. If you'd like to come to the front.
Without knowing the history, but I have a question regarding the remarks of the comrade before about the sort of modernization on the women's question by Mohammed. I think that women's oppression can't have been very strong in a society which is living on such a basic level. So I can't imagine that women had a very inferior role in a nomadic society. And the question is whether these laws regarding women were more a reflection of this life and not some sort really of modernization and the intriguing idea of helping women and so on.
I'd like to thank Jad for his talk, like many other comrades, but I do think that it is extremely important for us to really absorb what he said, because not just on the right wing of British society, but unfortunately in areas of the left, there is a latent or unexpressed Islamophobia and the assumption that somehow Christianity is more progressive than Islam. And when you listen to Jad's explanation, I'm reminded actually of the explanation of the rise of Christianity. Christianity was a small and irrelevant sect until the Roman Empire was so torn apart that it was in the interests of Constantine and that ruling class to adopt a unifying ideology. And the way in which Jad has presented his argument shows that there are important parallels there. And I think what Jad has said is important for another reason. It is that really under many Muslim regimes, the question of tolerance for both Jew, Muslim and Christian to live together was very often, not always, but often the norm. And the comrade earlier mentioned Andalusia, El-Andalus, and that was a society which actually is really well written about by Tariq Ali, among other people. But it underlines that it was a tolerant society that was then smashed to pieces by the conquistador, by the conquista. And you only have to go to Cordoba or Seville to see the most appalling way in which Muslim culture was obliterated by building churches on mosques, by oppressing people, and so on. And therefore, the whole tenor of this meeting, I think, is an argument which we have to take into the movement, and thanks to Jad for really enabling me to do that more effectively.
Arthur, the next speaker, saw a hand at the back. Yeah, you actually both of you can come down one after the other. And yeah, after that will be the final contribution before I bring up Jad, who's got a lot to get back to.
So on the question of the context of Islam within Christianity and Judaism, Islam sees itself as the end of the monotheistic message. So that's the kind of context. So it incorporates Jesus Christ as a prophet Islam. I'm a lapsed Muslim, by the way, so I get to know this when then I get to say it. But so Jesus is considered a prophet in Islam. John is considered a prophet in Islam. Christians are protected and revered, the prophets are revered. Same with Judaism. So that's the context, that the people existing who were Christians and Jews, it was a short leap to accept, even nominally, the notion of monotheism. Paternalistic monotheism, that goes its roots maybe back to Zoroaster and Akhenaten, another subject, obviously. So, but the appeal of Islam is its universality, that there are rights, rich and poor being equal, black and white being equal, men and women, of course. So that equality, that notion of equality appealed, plus the legal concepts that there was a framework in law, plus the idea of taxation, the idea of the common treasury. These appealed to people. Muslims in Malaysia and Indonesia, comrades, didn't become Muslim because armies arrived at their door. Something appealed to the notion, and that appeal is a kind of an egalitarian. Class is the analysis. It appealed to the working classes because they saw themselves as equals even to their financial betters. So that's an important thing, I think.
I'm picking up on a couple of points that people kind of alluded to. Around about when the G8 came to Gleneagles, that's how long ago it was. I worked for a guy who was a Muslim. He wanted to bring a book out. I was proofreading the book for him, and he said the book was going to be titled "Islam is Just Bolshevism Plus God." And we had the most fantastic chats about it. I was like, that bullshit, obviously, but the chats we had were very interesting. A couple of things that people have mentioned just made me think of that thing again. So how much import can we place into that? It's like, is it just Bolshevism plus God? Someone else?
Yeah, that's the best question. Look, one of the things that the kind of Islamophobes throw at Islam to underline their argument that's, uniquely backward and so on, is to say, where's your Enlightenment? Where's your Reformation? Where's your Renaissance? And I think, Jad left the story about the development of Islam, about this huge expanding empire. I mean, my all too limited reading, what you then see is actually a huge transformation of the means of subsistence, an agricultural revolution, which transforms the level of surplus in society. And it's true, there's not a crude interrelationship between material wealth and culture. But if you have more wealth, more food, and so on, one of the things you can do is create an army of intellectuals. And what you see in, say, is a cultural revolution that takes place. I think it's 8th, 9th century. You see something called the translation movement over a couple of, where, ancient Greek texts, in particular, things lost in much of medieval Europe, are translated, absorbed into the intellectual culture, feed into the development not just of an independent philosophy, but independent science. And if you think about the Renaissance, where do these texts re-emerge from? I mean, I was taught at university political philosophy by a brilliant young Greek-American scholar. He used to say to me, it's all about class struggle, Mark. And he used to say, and I still remember this, that in medieval Europe there was an Aristotelian and a Platonic tradition. But before that, within Islam, there was an Aristotelian and Platonic tradition. This is where these ideas survived and were renewed. And it was at the interface, particularly in northern Spain, with Christian Europe, that these books and works would re-enter the world of the Renaissance. And therefore, it's a slight exaggeration, because probably something like the Renaissance would have happened elsewhere, but its richness and diversity and its cultural advances could not have happened without Islam. No Islam, no Renaissance.
All right, thanks, Nadia. Thanks, everyone. Bolshevism plus God. I mean, this is what you get when you say that Muhammad bended the stick, right? But more seriously, it does ask the question that I think two other contributors make, which is what's the deal with Islam and capitalism? Can there be social inequality in Islam? What about the question of interest? Well, yeah, interest was banned. That was one of the first things one of the first teachings, and one of the first things that was actually implemented was the banning of interest. But it's because you had a very small financial aristocracy that lended money with like 200% interest a day to really poor people. So there was this, the whole question of interest was kind of a symbolic cutting edge of the despotism of the financial elite of the time. And there's a whole book that deals with the question of interest, actually, and how it was actually applied in Islamic societies. And it's written by Maxime Rodinson, and it's called Capitalism and Islam. It's not all good, but it does have a lot of empirical evidence that actually this ban was never really respected, and Muslims were really, really quick to find a way around it, and that's why you have Islamic banking today, which is basically like, Judeo-Christian banking, except, they don't call it interest. But at the end of the day, the same result. And this happened really, really, really quickly. Because, again, the question that we have to ask is, well, who's controlling society? Who's the ruling class? And which way are they going to bend the stick? When you're a ruling aristocracy that is now ruling in the name of Islam, well, you're not going to, insist on the question of interest. You might insist on the question of charity because, there's this paternalistic thing towards the poor and so on and so forth. But really, to sum up, there is nothing in Islam that prevents or encourages capitalism. Okay, because there's also the other argument that, Islamic countries are more backward because Islam is not like Protestantism and it was kind of a barrier to capitalism as an ideology. There's absolutely no actual evidence of that. Okay? And you can find this kind of contradiction where Islam can appeal poor people because when you talk about equality before God and so on and so forth, poor people can start thinking about, material equality, while rich people will say, well, equality before the law, that means law and order, that means a respect of property. And this is, I'm really summing up, but this is the ideological flexibility which explains, even today, organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which are extremely contradictory, which can pull the poor, which can pull a core cadre of middle-class people who are, by their material condition kind of between the poor and the rich, and who can pull sections of the rich who are really encouraged by the conservative aspect of the message. Okay, so we have to ask who's interpreting before we decide that this or that ideology is absolutely progressive, absolutely reactionary. Okay, now on the question of the quick spread, I mentioned the Enlightenment explanation of Muhammad being a fraud and fooling people into following him. And then, unfortunately, someone else talked about kind of a historic fraud of imposing Islam after they had conquered because they needed, a justification after that. That's not how ideology happens. Okay? No one comes and says, okay, I'm going to impose this ideology because, it'll be a great imposture. This is, I'm sorry, this is kind of a lazy explanation. The reason why Islam spread so quickly, or the Islamic armies spread so quickly, it's explained by Chris Harman. They're on the rise. They've got religious zeal, and they've got all this energy and all this fighting experience. And they have camels. Camels are extremely important. Okay, they can go 100 mile a day in the desert, carrying 200 kilograms without eating for like 5 days. You don't get anything else like that until the internal combustion engine is invented. And the Muslims knew how to use this against the really static, lazy, heavy Byzantine armies. And as I've also emphasized, the Jews and the Christians didn't want to support the Byzantines against the Muslims. And you even had Christian tribes, Christian Arab tribes, who had been kind of assimilated in the Byzantine Empire, that fought on the side of the Muslims. It's the example of the Ghassanids, for instance. But it is true that the Muslims didn't really impose their ideology at first, because think about it, put yourself in their shoes. You were in the desert for a very long time, and suddenly, you'd heard of Damascus, and you'd heard of Aleppo, and you'd heard of Alexandria, and suddenly you're there and you have to rule. They didn't impose themselves, and they didn't destroy the Byzantine states. At first, the first generation, so for decades, they settled in small camps on the fringes of the town, small military camps. They were called the Amsar, and this is where the word Masr comes from, which is Arabic for Egypt. So they settled there because, well, they simply don't know yet how to rule this state, and they slowly ease themselves into it. And another reason why there was not this really quick kind of cultural homogenization is that there was civil war for a very long time in the Muslim Empire. Right after Omar dies, so this is 12 years after the death of the Prophet, we've got a new caliph, which is really who really represents the aristocracy, and this starts a civil war. And from this, you have the really long struggle after this caliph is killed by an angry mob, angry protesters. Then you have the long struggle between Ali on the one hand and Muawiyah on the other, and it is the ultimate victory of Muawiyah because Ali compromised and was actually killed by his own supporters. Some of his own supporters basically declared that Ali was an infidel and an apostate, and they killed him because he tried to compromise with the aristocracy, because he wanted unity, and this was also his weakness. And it is only after that that you have really the cultural flourishing of the Islamic empires under the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus, and then you've got the Abbasids who make a revolution, move it to Baghdad, and then you've got a new caliphate that emerges in Cairo. So there is always struggle. On the question of women's oppression, yes, at the time it was progressive. One comrade said that women couldn't have been so oppressed in a nomadic society. We're no longer in a nomadic society. We're in a society where old values of solidarity, of equality, are trampled to the... It's really shocking. It's a cultural shock for the people who are on the receiving end of those changes. And this includes women who actually belong to the ruling classes. We're talking about Omar. Omar was the second caliph. How did he... The story goes that he was converted by his own sister after he wanted to kill her. He meant to kill her, and then he meant to kill her for converting to Islam. She converted to Islam before him, and he wanted to kill her, and she could kind of convince him, and so on and so forth. So many women of the ruling class or of the better off sections of society that turned to Islam too. And it was not only the oppressed, although the first martyr of Islam is considered to be Sumayya, and she was a woman and a former slave, and obviously very, very poor. And she was killed because she was a former slave, because she wasn't protected by any tribe. But, so again, I don't want to get into, is Islam absolutely progressive towards women, or is it not? if you want an answer, ask Muslim women today. Okay, I think they wouldn't, the one among themselves who consider themselves feminists certainly wouldn't accept to live the way the first Muslim women lived, because, they have something better and they can conciliate their faith with a new social reality. And that's kind of okay, So it really depends on context. So it can be liberating and it can be sometimes, non-liberating, but we have to look at social forces that are using it. Is Islam liberating for women in Saudi Arabia? Absolutely not. Can Islam be a form of rebellion, a form of liberation for a young woman in France wearing a hijab? Yes, it can. Okay, because it can be seen as a defiance to against racists and the French state. Okay, I think one last thing about Judaism. Yes, there is a link between Islam and Judaism because the Meccans knew about Christianity, they knew about Judaism, because of the settled tribe with whom they exchanged. Actually, before they settled in Mecca, they knew about Christians and Jews before they settled in Mecca, because it's those people that sold them dates. But they knew really weird versions of Christianity, which if you go into details of the Quran and so on and so forth, there are references to Christianity that might seem odd today because Muhammad actually got them from what we might call heretic Christians. There is actual knowledge, and actually Muhammad is supposed to be Khatam al-Nabiyyin, so he is the last of the prophets, which it's a long list that includes Moses, Abraham, Jesus, and so on and so forth. And the relationship with the Jews, yes, there was a relationship with the Jews in Medina, and it was in Medina that Muhammad first started the institutionalization of Islam. So that you should pray, that there is Ramadan, that there is certain religious discipline to observe. There are things that you can eat, things that you cannot. In many ways, it was really close to the Jewish practices of the time, and we see an attempt to kind of differentiate Islam from those Jewish tribes when conflicts arise in Medina between the Jews and the Muslims. Is there anything else? Now, the satanic verses. Basically, the explanation is that if you're not a religious believer, you have to tell yourself that the revelations come to Muhammad from his subconscious in one way or another. Okay, it is the same kind of inspiration that artists can get. It comes in many forms and so on and so forth. And so there is a case for, it's a careful case, but there is a case for tracing the chronology of the revelations, so the verses of the Quran, to Muhammad's situation, his doubts. He goes through really, it's an exhausting process, getting a message from God for Muhammad. It's psychologically, physically very difficult. And so he gets doubt. And I think the question of the satanic verses was that there was introduced an ambiguity about, is there only one God, or is there one main God, and there are some secondary gods? I think that this can be traced back to the fact that some of the polytheists who worshipped around the Kaaba viewed their individual gods, their idols, as some sort of intermediaries between them and what we may call a single deity. So there was this kind of ambiguity at the time. And the word Allah, it's not the Muslims who invented it, it's the Meccans, it's the polytheistic Meccans. But in Arabic, it means the God. So there was this kind of ambiguity, and this is perhaps something that was, tormenting Muhammad at the time. This is the satanic verses, and I'll stop it here. Thank you very much.